You know, it was a wooden floor, and it was always a little sawdust on the floor. I can remember that, and the aisles went straight down. Going over to Dillon's was where, you know, I mean, you could get a soda or something else, or you'd be getting something for your parents.
And it was just a warm feeling. They knew you by name, and I could just remember as a little kid feeling that it was a warm, happy place.
I think Dillon's Market was really special because of the way in which my grandfather and father approached the business.
It was familiar, it was pleasant, it was just friendly. And I think my father and grandfather really personified that. They were what the store was. My grandfather was born in Windsor. His father, my great-grandfather, who was named John, he was actually born in Scotland. And part of the great Irish immigration, there was a group that in America we call the Scotch Irish, which was a group of people who went from Ireland to Scotland and then very soon came to the United States.
Yeah, I think he was probably 6'3", 6'4", something of that nature. So yes, he was a very distinguished gentleman, and he always acted that way. Loved his cigars. I can remember him sitting in his chair where he always sat in the evening and smoking his cigar. He had one of those cigar trays. I guess it was like a pedestal kind of thing with a cigar tray up on the top, and he would just twirl it there and listen to the Red Sox on the radio.
Well, James Dillon started working as a meat cutter around 1912 at least. He also was a clerk for Albert Lennox in Albert Lennox's meat market. They formed a partnership somewhere around at least 1914, 1915. They had a grocery called Dillon and Lennox, which was in the building. It was called the Ellsworth and Philly building. It was also called the Bank building because the Windsor Trust was there. But the Dillon's Market really moved around a number of times.
It seemed as though he was a little standoffish, but over the years, I've heard so many stories about how warm and funny, and he was a practical joker, and he was so kind to people. And I heard those stories later in life and realized that I never really got to know my grandfather like I wish I had. But I would say about 1910, we have knowledge of him working as a butcher, and that was just prior to him owning the store. But he started butchering, and the person that he was working with thought he was so intelligent and so good at the job and so great with customers that eventually he became a partner.
I'm the youngest of 3 children, so I didn't know my grandfather all that well. He died when I was quite young. But I do remember walking into the store and walking in the big back step and seeing in the mirror. And at that, of course, he was very, seemed to me to be ancient at the time. But he was, even in his later years, he was in the store going up and down the shelves with his feather duster, dusting off the cans and putting them back in. And I kind of watched that and I said, is that all he ever does? And, you know, he was at the time, but, you know, he'd had a lifetime of work behind him, so he deserved to just kind of walk up and down the aisles, talk to the people, and dust off the cans.
He married Catherine Hayden of Rainbow, and they were married for 46 years.
Definitely have memories of my grandmother growing up because she lived just one house away from us, so we were down at her place quite a bit. And she was always at the stove, always cooking, because in those days my grandfather wanted to have a full meal, morning, noon, at night. So I remember her standing up at lunchtime cooking those chops and making gravy.
The thing you remember most about my grandmother is her devotion to her faith. She was very, very religious, went to church literally every day of her life to Mass.
That's how my grandmother and grandfather met, was through the church.
In his obituary, they called my grandfather the dean of the Windsor businesses because he had been there so long and he had known everyone, and he took part in so many things. He was a director of what at the time was the Windsor Bank and Trust. And you know, you had your finger in your pie everywhere in those days as a small businessman.
James Dillon Sr. was very active in town. He was the Windsor Fire Chief starting in 1916. He was also a member of the Fire District Commission, the town's Fire District Commission. He was a board member of the Windsor Trust, and in 1939 he was elected to the town's Board of Finance. In 1953, he received the Outstanding Citizen Award from the Raymond B. McHugh's post of the VFW. He was Windsor's 1960 Chamber of Commerce senior member, and he was very active in St. Gabriel's Church, serving on many committees there, as well as being a trustee. In February of 1965, James J. Dillon Sr. died, and there was a letter to the editor in the Hartford Times. It said, "He was selfless, honest, and kind. The public was an integral part of his life, and he served it well. He was unbiased, fair, a keen student of human nature, a good judge of character, and he made no distinctions in regard to origin, race, or creed."
My dad grew up on Pequannock Avenue in a small house over there, which is no longer there. It's now where the parking lot of Jim's Restaurant is. I think it's still Jim's Restaurant. And then they moved over to Ridgewood.
I think my father was expected to work in the business. It was just a natural progression from father to son. And I'm sure that he worked in the store when he was going to school, after school. He did the deliveries, he stocked. And so it kind of became a natural thing. My father had two sisters, an older and a younger sister. And they weren't really involved in the store too much, except, of course, that they shopped there. But they did own the building. My grandfather had made sure that everyone in the family had a little bit of a cut of the store. And so they owned the building, and my father owned the business part.
Dad attended what he always called the high school, and John Fitch, which was, when I was a kid, was elementary school and is now apartments right on Bloomfield Avenue.
He was quite a baseball player. I think he was a bit of a practical joker and probably was the class clown in school as well. I don't know exactly when they met, but I know it was before the war. I know that he was with a bunch of his buddies and they were driving, I think, to West Hartford, where my mother came from. They were driving in a car, a bunch of buddies having a good time, and I believe they were picking up one of their girlfriends, and my mother happened to be with them. And they all got in the car and pushed my mother towards my father, and she didn't like him at first. He was very full of himself and confident, she said. And he was such a jokester, and she didn't get along with him at first, but that only lasted for about a date or two, and then they fell in love.
We had started off living above the store, and I don't really remember that, and if I lived there, it was like until I was 1 year old. Then we moved to the Ridgewood Road location where we lived.
I actually lived up above the store on two different occasions, once as a child and then once as an adult when I first got married. But when I was younger, you know, we had the whole upstairs, and it was a pretty big place.
And it was very homey, and lived in the center of town, and as a kid it was wonderful to live in the center because there were so many things to do. And it was easy to just go downstairs and, you know, get something to eat. And when we were a little bit older, my mother would send us down to pick stuff up at the store. And so I got to see Dad working during the day, and I got to see my grandfather and all the people that worked in the store.
We lived on Pequannock Avenue, which is where Jim's Pizza is now. Our house was there, and they demolished the house to put Jim's Pizza up. So it's interesting that there were 5 or 6. So there's Smith and Burke, M&E Market. If you go down, Celio's at the corner of Loomis and Pequannock Avenue had a little store there. And then keep going down, and Schweiger's, although it didn't have meat, it did have dry goods, and it had an ice cream parlor, which is where Jim's Pizza ended up going, the initial Jim's Pizza. And then we go to Dillon's, And then we go a little further down to Zizitsky's, Aaron Zizitsky, which was in the Plaza Theater.
In the old days, before World War II era, when you came in to buy your groceries, you'd walk into the counter and there's 2 or 3 guys behind the counter, and you'd say, "I'd like a can of corn." The clerk would go and get the can of corn, bring it, put it back on the counter. You say, "I want a can of beets." He'd go get the can of beets. It wasn't self-serve, which is what we have now, where you put your things in a cart. The changeover to self-service didn't happen until after my father returned from World War II. When he had been out on the West Coast during the war, he had, that was the new thing out there, was the self-service grocery store. And he wrote to my grandfather about it. And after war, when my grandfather brought my dad into the business, they decided to modernize and have a self-service grocery store. So that's kind of where that came from.
My father was really proud to be in the Marines. He volunteered to serve in the war. He didn't talk a lot about his experience in the war. I don't think a lot of people in World War II spoke of that.
He served in the Marshall Islands. He went in as a Marine, grew through the ranks such as he could without being a lieutenant or anything like that. I think staff sergeant was the highest level he could grow to, so he did that. I was very proud of his military service as well. He should be, but the only thing he would ever say is, "These are things that you don't want to know about that that happened over there." He did share one thing that I do remember is he said something about one night sleeping in his bed, and of course there were bunks, all through the whole area, and he said he had to get up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and while he was up, a grenade hit, and I guess shrapnel and stuff came down and went through his bed, and he said if he had still been there, it would have been a lot different as what may have happened to him.
And he said that is why he marched every single Memorial Day in the parade. Memorial Day was very big for him. He said he owed it to all of the people that didn't come back.
But my memories of him, of course, has always been in the Memorial Day parade. He was a master sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, and was in WW2, and was always at the parades. Him and a fellow by the name of Billy Carter, who was in the Army. Both, you could definitely count on them to be in all the parades, and they had walked all the time too. So
He and my dad were like the parade organizers or marshals for the Memorial Day parade every year. There was a representative. My dad was in the Army, and Jim Dillon was in the Marine Corps. So, and the two of them would make sure that the parade was all organized. Everybody knew what they were going to do, and they just did that for years and years and years.
Even the last few years of his life when he was blind, he still marched in the parade and raised the flag. And we think he might have the record for having marched in the Memorial Day parade for the longest amount of time. But it was very important to him.
From time to time, on a Saturday or something, I'd go over and I'd bag groceries for my dad, and everyone is making a big fuss about delivering groceries, and we did it back in in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s.
As far back as I can remember, we were always part of the store. I do remember going with my father to some of his stops. He would deliver, I think, meat mostly to some of the manufacturing places around Windsor. My primary job as I grew was to deliver the groceries. So the deliveries, that wasn't a new thing. We did that way back in the day, as they say.
Being a small business, there was never more than 10 employees at the most there. Most of them were long-term. We had 2 of our employees, 2 great guys. One was Lester Easton. Lester Easton worked, I happened to find his obituary that we'd kept the other day. He'd worked for the store for 52 years. And he actually almost died in the store. I was standing next to him one day, standing behind the meat counter, and he was just standing there and he wasn't moving. And we kind of looked at him, and we had to put him aside and sat him down for a while, and he'd had a stroke. and they took him to the hospital, and he passed away after that.
They knew everybody. They knew everybody that came in. They knew you by name. As I say, I can remember the personalities. George Nickel, who used to kind of be in charge of the produce section, as I remember it. He was just this gentlemanly, very gentlemanly, small man, but with pure white hair and just such round cheeks, and he always smiled, and always treated the the children like they were special. I can probably even gave us an apple or an orange or something.
Both the father and son were there when I was young. But I remember going to the deli, and on the way to the deli, there were these bags along the side of the aisle. And in it were different sized rolls. There were grinder rolls and hard rolls. And on Sundays, I'd go in there and get cold cuts, and then pick up a different roll from different bags and put them in one bag and go out.
No matter where you were, Mr. Nickel would have a smile on his face, and when you walked in the back, there were these big, two tall men with the white hats, and obviously dressed in the all in sanitary garb or whatever it was. But those were the butchers. Those were the men who would take the meat out and very carefully place it. But they would always talk to the kids, and I can remember pressing your face against that glass in the counter and just looking at those things.
James Jr. was just as involved in civic affairs as his father. He was a member and officer of the volunteer fire department, and he helped found the Windsor Volunteer Ambulance Company. In the 1950s, he helped raise money to get the fire department its first ambulance. And in 1979, he actually worked to make the ambulance company its own autonomous group.
I can remember being in there and having the fire horn go off when the fire department was in the center of town off of Union Street, where the police station was, and having Jim Jr. run out because he was in the fire department, as were so many of the businesses that were in town, in the center, because they were the only ones that had the manpower there during the day. And I'm sure probably to his father's dismay sometimes that he had to leave. But those were the things that they did.
Both my grandfather and father, and then my brother as well, were involved in the fire department. They were volunteer firemen. My grandfather was fire chief for quite a few years. And my father, I think, was with the fire company, volunteer fire company, for about 25 years. And Dad was responsible for raising funds and recognizing a need to have an ambulance in town. So he and Aaron Szycki really started the whole volunteer ambulance. And they were ambulance drivers, and every time they needed a new ambulance, they would raise more funds, and they would actually go and pick the car up and bring it back, and really started developing that whole volunteer ambulance need in town.
The fire department was a big part of my father's life, and it was also a big part of our lives because many of the activities that were sponsored and we got involved with had to do with the fire department.
In 1958, he was elected president of Windsor's Chamber of Commerce, and he actually received the Jerry Hallis Award from the Windsor Chamber of Commerce in 1993.
They were involved in the chamber by participating in events and understanding what the value of the chamber is and was at the time. Jim Dillon Jr. received the Hallis Award in 1993 for all his work in promoting small business.
Hallis Award is given to an individual who is a member of the Chamber of Commerce, who not only works with the Chamber of Commerce, but does outside work within the town to better the town.
We became very good friends through the Kiwanis Club. I mean, when I first came back and joined my father in the late 60s, 67, 68, I joined the Kiwanis Club, and Jim was there then. Well, of course, all of a sudden now that cuts through all the ages, even though I was in my 20s. These men that were in their 40s and late 40s and early 50s, well, now you were all club members together.
Everybody in the family was really heartbroken when Dad came home one day and said he had made the decision to close the store. It was the time when a lot of the bigger chain stores were coming in, and the generation that came into his store had begun to die off. And it's, you know, life just moves forward and changes.
During the time that it happened, we sold the property, or Dad sold the property in '76. During that era, you could see things were beginning to change. The store that the Geislers is in right now used to be First National. That used to be a big store. Now it's called a small neighborhood store. And it was just kind of inevitable that things were going to peter out. I talked about Plaza Market, a little small store that went out of business. Smith and Burke went out of business. It was just, you could kind of see the writing on the wall.
He always said, you don't want to go into this. It's only going to get harder. Don't ever do anything to do with retail, because the hours are going to increase and the pressure is going to increase over the years.
My dad had always told me that he had told his father that he would never let the business go under. So he chose to end it on his terms.
So it was a tough decision to make, but we had a big party in the end. He invited all of his old customers to come back.
It did affect all of us, of course, because it wasn't just the store. It was our life, as a family for many years.
And it was a constant parade in and out. Family. His sisters came up. One of them lived in North Granby. The other lived out in West Hartford. They came back. Really, it had outlived its time. It was an old-fashioned business in a changing modern world, and it couldn't compete with margins for the bigger stores. And he'd rather see it, like say, close the doors by himself than someone forcing him to.
Dad, after he retired, he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do, but he fell into real estate. He wanted to do something where he would still have contact with people. Oh, that's right, I forgot. He was Grandpa Jim over at the Montessori school. I don't know how he got into it, but he went and volunteered. He was looking for something, in his odd hours, and somehow he found that they were looking to have somebody older come in and be with the kids, and they loved him. I mean, there are pictures of the kids just hanging off of him.
Being privileged to handle his funeral arrangements when Jim Jr. died. But in the last few years, he was almost blind, and it was difficult for him to see, and yet he wanted to go to Kiwanis. And usually one of his children would bring him to the Windsor house or wherever we were meeting and everything. And I can remember bringing him home on several occasions, because he was always, and as stubborn as he was, I'd offer to help him to the door. And no, once I'm on my driveway, I know my way, and he could do it even though he couldn't see. But even though here he was blind and having a great deal of difficulty getting around, he wanted to go to those club meetings and had input, and had input, and would certainly tell you if you were making a mistake or there was something that could have been done better. Yep, but he was there. He was there. And so that's, again, kind of special, because that makes that whole circle, as I think about it, which I didn't then, but seeing that tall man with the white cap behind the butcher counter when you're a little kid, and then that same man who is now, stooped and frail. And you're able to bring him home from a meeting that he wanted very much to participate in. So that's really a privilege for me.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. It was the way we reacted with the customers, their customer service, and being part of it. Everybody was welcome. Everybody was appreciated. We spoke to everybody. We didn't just let them walk around and buy the groceries. check them out and say goodbye. You know, we always talked with them, interacted with them, knew their families. They knew ours, and that was a big part of it.
I was the third generation. My brother and I were the third generation in that store. We had customers who were third generation.
Myself and my younger brother Tim and my older brother Tom got together and made a plaque for him and presented him with a plaque thanking him for being who he was, basically, for being such a great example in life, for having such a great sense of humor and including us in the joy that was Dillon's Market, and for being our dad.
But you know, the fun things were to go across the street to where the stores were. You know, we used to take and get the refrigerator boxes from King's and take them and make forts out of them and everything. But then, of course, we would go to Mrs. Swiger's had the penny candy store that was just down the street on Pequannock Avenue.
We had a little tiny grocery cart, just a wire grocery cart, child-sized. A little kid could stand up there and put their hand on it and push it around. And every girl and every boy who came in went right over to that groceries cart because it was their size. And even if they never put anything in it, they'd push that thing up and down the aisles. And you know, many times they'd follow their mother along, and the mother would put, you know, a can of corn or something in the things for them, and they'd go down the end of the aisle and they'd turn around and come back the other way. And Dad would always say, "Oh, you found the cart." "Yeah, you did." So they were always thrilled with that cart.
There's a story of him, as a matter of fact, being in town, and there was a policeman who had a police cruiser, and he would always park it and leave the police cruiser running in it. I guess he used to drive my father crazy when he was a teenager. And one time it was parked with the motor running, and my father got in the car and moved it and parked it a few blocks away and left it there. And of course they suspected that it was him. However, I don't think they ever caught him. So he would do little things like that, so he was a bit of an imp.